Welcome to week 12. This week for professional practice in nursing, we are going to be talking about legal and ethical issues that nurses will find themselves dealing with. So we know that nursing and ethics go hand in hand as adults. By now, we have probably developed our own personal standards of the way we represent ourselves and the way we conduct ourselves in certain situations. And we know that in most aspects of life, we will base any decision that we make on our own personal beliefs or our values that we have developed. We can consider these our own ethical principles. So ethics is based on an expected behavior of a certain group in relationship to what is, for that group, considered right or wrong. Our morals are the values and beliefs that are held by each person. Those morals help guide our behavior and help us make decisions. And then we do have something called ethical theory. So this is a way to analyze different philosophies, different systems, ideas, and it's the principles that are used to make judgments regarding issues surrounding what is right, what is wrong, and what is believed to be good or bad. So we know that as a nurse, we have an obligation to do good, not to do harm. And we are committed to providing a very safe, high quality level of nursing to all of the patients that we take care of. We know that patients are human beings, and as human beings, they all have certain rights. We have to apply equally to every human that we take care of all of those certain rights. Human rights are privileges that people have, and they are the right to expect because they're human. So there are certain rights that humans are entitled to. So we have a couple organizations, NFLPN and NAPNIs. We've talked about these throughout the last year. They are, one of the things they do is they develop a code of ethics for practical and vocational nurses. And their purpose is to provide a list of rules that establish good conduct. They also attempt to describe the ideals of the group, and they are also responsible for identifying standards in behavior that should be followed. So we know in life, not just in nursing, that we need to have personal accountability. So personal accountability is being responsible. So that means that you are accepting the cause of an action. It also means being accountable to accept the consequences of an action. And then being held accountable for what you do and how you do it is probably going to be the most rewarding part of your career. It's going to allow you to be proud of how you perform your nursing skills. You're going to be able to feel personal satisfaction about the knowledge that you're gaining as you start to go into the real world and you start taking care of patients and you start to gain that experience. And then there are going to be other people that you work with that are going to admire you because of the high ethical standards that you will have in your practice. So unfortunately, not everyone that you know or not every healthcare worker that you work with is going to adhere to their code of ethics or base their principles of practice on a higher level of ethical standards like they should. So you will see that. Whoops, sorry, forgot to change the slide. So unethical behavior, which can be considered disregard for basic human rights, is going to be the failure to adhere to that code of ethics. Failure to base your practice on those high ethical standards that we talked about, and then disregard for basic human rights. Ethical dilemmas. So ethical dilemmas are a situation in which there's a conflict or some type of opposition between personal values, principles, laws, personal and professional obligations, and then the right of the individual and society. So these are situations where there's no clear course of action. There's no yes or no answer. And some people might not even recognize that they're in ethical dilemmas at first. So some of the ethical dilemmas just some examples that you may find yourself in. Your book talks about a couple. So medications and patient care errors, theft of supplies and equipment, inadequate access to healthcare, substandard performance by peers, working in situations where the shortage of nursing staff compromises the quality of care, working with a nurse who's a substance abuser. So those are just some of the ones that you could see in the healthcare system with your employer, but then there's other ones too that we think about with patients with regards to treatments and unfair issues that deal with them. So we're going to talk about that in detail. So there is a general guideline that has been recommended that we should follow if we think that we're in an ethical dilemma or we know that we're in one. Your book talks about this. There's a nice case study on page 218, box 810-2. I do recommend that you guys read that. So the general guideline says that you want to collect all the facts. So let's really take a good look at the situation. Who's all involved? What's happening? We always want to stick to the facts. We want to leave all the extra stuff out, facts only. We want to, after we gather all the facts, then we want to start asking questions about the behavior. So what exactly happened? Do we think that this problem is a legal issue or do we think it's an ethical one? Then we want to move on to ask yourself, what would happen if everyone acted or behaved in this same manner? Would it be okay if this happened? Would it cause more problems? Obviously, you want to discuss your concerns with your immediate supervisor or that person of authority above you. You should also sit back and think about what your motivation is in this situation. After you've done all those, you can choose a course of action. And then ultimately, depending on what that outcome is, we have to be prepared to accept any consequences. So I would like to see you guys go to page 218, box 10-2, and read over that ethical dilemma case study. It's very interesting. So we know that nurses face ethical dilemmas almost every day. Like I said, sometimes whether we realize it or not. So dilemmas can happen when a nurse believes that he or she cannot provide the level of care that's appropriate and safe for the patient. So one of the things that we see that's considered an ethical dilemma is staffing shortages. So it can be very hard for a nurse to provide adequate care to 5 patients, for example, when the acuity is too high, or maybe when they don't have a tech or a CNA on the floor to help them, and they're ultimately responsible for providing all that care. And if that nurse doesn't have any help, any CNA or a tech that they can delegate those appropriate delegating tasks to, then the nurse can't care for all the patients like she should, especially if the acuity is too high. Excessive paperwork and administrative tasks is another thing that we may see. It can be very hard to choose between what the patient needs and what the employer is requiring of us. So we know that our employers have certain expectations. We're expected to document, a certain amount of documentation every day. It has to be done. But then, when we're doing that, we're taking time away from what our patients need. And if we have a high acuity of patients, then we're kind of put in that situation where, okay, my patient really needs this, but I'm also expected to do this. And I really can't do it after work, after my time is up, because they're cutting down on hours and we have to, punch out by a certain time. So those are kind of some of the things that we see in the nursing place. Anything that's going to cause risk to personal health and safety, obviously. managed care, mandatory overtime, cost containment measures. Other issues we see are the right to refuse to assist with a procedure that you believe is moral or ethically wrong. So we've talked about this over the last year, how you guys really need to do that self-awareness. Look within yourself, know what your values are, what your guiding principles are, and know what you are capable of providing. So if you know that you are very pro-life and you do not believe in abortion, then working as a nurse in an abortion center is constantly going to cause conflict for you. So that's probably not the best place for you to be. There's a lot of different things to do in nursing. So it would just be a good idea if you did something else. So as a nurse, it's important to keep in mind that you do have the right as a nurse to refuse to assist with any type of a procedure that you believe is morally or ethically wrong, but you do not have the legal right to refuse to provide nursing care for the patient. So if you do not ethically or morally believe that abortion is correct, you do not have to assist with that actual procedure, but you are not legally able to refuse care for the person who has had the abortion. So just need to keep that in mind. And we cannot refuse to provide nursing care for a patient. So bioethics, if you work in a hospital now, or if you work in any other healthcare facility, you may be, and you may have found yourself involved in certain situations related to ethical implications of what we call biologic research and application. So this is what we call bioethics. So part of being a human is being able to have the right to make choices. And we do know that we've had a big advancement in science and technology over the past 50 or 60 years. So because of those advancements, now our patients have more choices. So some examples of bioethical issues that we see today are organ transplants, organ donations, advanced life support systems, genetic testing, stem cell engineering, and then of course we have alternative methods for conception and contraception. And all these issues can cause bioethical issues. So most hospitals do have bioethics committee. These committees are responsible for bringing all available information and points of view regarding these dilemmas. They do have members that serve on a committee. These members are composed of doctors or comprised of doctors, administrators, social workers, philosophers, and ethicists. And what they do is they make a decision about an action that's going to be taken regarding this dilemma. So some of the contemporary bioethical dilemmas that we see today really revolve around these reproductive issues. So birth control, abortion, and alternative fertilization. And we do have to understand as nurses that as medicine evolves and we start to see new treatments for different diseases, there's going to be more and more bioethical dilemmas that occur. So we know we have genetic issues as well. So there's something called the Human Genome Project. This was a government-funded research project that started back in 1990. When it was started, the goal of the project was to be able to determine the arrangement of human genes and then to be able to map the entire genetic script by the year 2005. They were able to do that. We know that genes are responsible for more than 1,800 diseases that we've identified so far. And there are more than 2,000 genetic tests for diagnosing different human conditions. So we have drugs that are designed to target specific genetic abnormalities in response to therapy. Genetic screening, we can do this. This is done to confirm a suspected diagnosis and then to predict the possibility of a future illness. So we could do genetic screening on a fetus to see if there's any issues with them. It helps the mom to be able to make a decision. They have the option to terminate the pregnancy if they see any abnormalities. We can do genetic screenings for a woman who has a strong history of breast cancer in her family to determine if she has what her probability of developing breast cancer is. So that's genetic screening. Stem cell research, this is where we know that embryonic stem cells are going to be found in those developing embryos. Those stem cells will eventually develop into all its tissues and the organs in the body. But some researchers also know that they offer promise to the development of medical treatments for a lot of different conditions. So conditions where there's been damage to the brain or the spinal cord and the skeletal muscles. But embryonic stem cells require, to get these cells to use for these different conditions, we have to destroy the embryo. And pro-life advocates are very strongly opposed to this because they consider it human life. Organ transplants is also a bioethical issue. A couple issues are surrounding that. So the cost of the surgery. So it is estimated that $1 million it's going to cost at least $1 million between the surgery and the follow-up for the patient during the first year. So it does come at a very added expense. There's the cost of lifelong drug therapies because we know these patients have to take those anti-rejection drugs for the rest of their life. And these medications can be expensive. Some of the testing or some of the transplants we see involve animal parts, so there's ethical dilemmas surrounding that. There's various religious objections, and then we see buying and selling organs. So people that are not able to be on a list for organ transplant for one reason or another, or they don't have time to wait. There is times when we've heard of people who are trying to buy and sell organs, which obviously has ethical issues surrounding that. So when we talk about death, so the criteria for death to be able to actually declare a patient to be dead, what they do now is it's on the basis of an electroencephalogram. So the patient would have this electroencephalogram, and this is going to be where this would indicate the absence of any brainwave activity. So death is going to be legally defined as the irreversible cessation of brain function for a certain given period. We know that regardless of the absence of this brain activity, because of modern medicine, we have the ability to continue biological function. So we have respirators, we have heart and lung machines. So even though the patient may not technically have any brain activity, we can still keep them alive for an undetermined amount of time. We can give them fluids, we can give them food. These machines can breathe for them. When we talk about euthanasia, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a mercy killing. This is when someone deliberately causes the death of someone else. So we can have active and passive euthanasia. So active is intentionally administering a medication or an agent that would bring about death. Passive is to cause someone's death by withholding life-sustaining efforts. So respirators, hearts, lung machines, food, things like that. Advanced directives. So this is kind of a repeat for you guys. We have learned about a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today. So advanced directives, remember, advanced directives are helpful for patients. The purpose of them is to communicate their wish regarding any type of end-of-life care if the client should be able to communicate those needs. So all clients that come into the healthcare facility are going to be required to ask if they have an advanced directive. A client who does not have an advanced directive must be given written information that outlines their rights related to their healthcare decisions and how they can formulate those advanced directives. We do have facilities have a healthcare representative that can be available to come and sit with the patient and help them with the process, because it can be very hard to understand and there's a lot of information. A living will, which is a type of an advance directive, is going to be that legal document that's going to express the patient's wish regarding any medical treatment that they do want or don't want in the event that they become incapacitated and they happen to find themselves facing end-of-life issues. So the types of treatments that are often addressed are those that have the capacity to prolong life. So do you want CPR? Do you not want CPR? Do you want to be intubated or you don't want to be intubated? Do you want to have artificial feedings or you don't? So these are the kind of things that we talk about. They also have the right to a healthcare proxy. So a healthcare proxy is a power of attorney that allows a person to make healthcare decisions for another person if they are not able to do so. There's something called the Ulysses Pact, which this is describes a situation in which a decision a person made in the past might not be the best decision for him or her in the future. So your book talks about a person that maybe several years ago signed a living will. Prior to that, they signed a living will, and then after that, the patient had an automobile accident. That person sustained some type of a brain or a spinal cord injury, and now the patient's on life support. Well, as we know, as the medical field progresses, we find ourselves getting new treatments, to new alternatives. So if that patient stays on life support for a number of years, and we see advancements in medicine, we might find ourselves in a situation where there may be now advances in medical treatments that would help them. So maybe we want to think about what the terms were of that legal living will and should it still be carried out. And then something for you guys to keep in mind, that regardless of what you see, whatever the patient decides, it might be the best, it is actually the best decision for that patient. But for us as nurses, it can be very difficult for us to accept some of the healthcare decisions that our patient makes. So that's just something that you guys should be aware of. So we know that it is a nurse's duty to do good. That's why we became nurses. So we want to do good and avoid harm in accordance with our state law. It's important that we know the laws that affect nursing practice, and practicing nursing staying within the confines of the law. We are able to provide safe, competent care to our patients. We're able to advocate for the client's rights. We're able to provide care that's within our scope of practice. We are able to discern the responsibilities of nursing in relation to the responsibilities of other members of the healthcare team. So what is our responsibility versus what is the responsibility of physical therapy? What is the doctor's responsibility? You know, when we talked about informed consent, we know that informed consent is not something that's within our scope of practice. We don't explain the procedures to the patients and have them sign the informed consent. It allows us to provide care that is consistent with those standards of care that have been established. And then it helps us, shields us from being liable for any type of negligence, malpractice, stuff like that. So Good Samaritan statutes, we know that these were developed to help protect people from prosecution who voluntarily decided to aid others in a time of an emergency. So if the person that's providing emergency care does so without acting reckless or does not intend to harm the victim, then that Good Samaritan law will keep them exempt from any legal action. It's intended to encourage people to give emergency care outside of the hospital or the healthcare facility. Some states actually require people to help strangers in distress. So it is good for you guys to know what your state laws are regarding that. But ultimately, to act or not to act is considered an ethical decision that you know, that you may be faced to make in an emergency situation in that non-institutional setting. So our sources of law, so our laws generally come from two different sources. So the first source we have is that government law, which is our federal, state, or local, and the second source is going to be our private law. So laws that come from the government are termed private or statutory laws. You can go to page 232, box 11-1 and look over sources of law. So we have constitutional law, administrative law, and criminal law. So constitutional laws are based on the Constitution of the United States and an individual state or a subdivision of that state. Our administrative law creates federal, state, and local administrative agencies that then have the power to make and enforce rules and regulations. And then our nurse practice acts are laws that are passed by state government to control the practice of nursing in that state. Criminal law deals more with offenses against welfare or safety of the public. Criminal law can include minor offenses, misdemeanors, and felonies. So minor offenses are traffic tickets, misdemeanors. Examples would be perjury, battery, libel, conspiracy, public nuisance. And then felonies are liable, examples would be liable for a death sentence or for a life sentence for, you know, some type of act that was considered a felony. Then we have private. So it's enforcement of rights, duties, and other legal relationships between private citizens. So we have contract law and laws of torts. So contract law, these are going to be your written contracts, and then laws of torts, that's going to be negligent. We're going to talk a little bit more about them. So law, when we talk about negligence, we talk about false imprisonment, confidentiality issues, defamation of character, consent issues, assault and battery. We are going to talk in detail about them. So we know that the Nurse Practice Act is part of that administrative law. It's going to define legal functions that the nurse has, powers and duties of the State Board of Nursing. The Nurse Practice Act is the State Board of Nursing is going to enforce the Nurse Practice Act. It's going to hold disciplinary hearings if someone has done something to breach that. It also identifies the membership of the board and how to become a board member. So usually it's RNs or LPNs and different consumers and other people that are interested in health and welfare of the state that sit on these boards. It's usually headed by an advanced director who does get a salary. It's usually an RN with paid staff, and they manage the daily issues related to nursing in that state. So the Nurse Practice Act also defines the terms. So the nursing and the duties of the nurse practitioner, that registered nurse, the licensed practical nurse. Our state boards do have the legal authority to interpret, implement, and enforce the laws that govern our nurse practice, education, and our licensure. And we know that disciplinary hearings and prosecution of violations of Nurse Practice Acts are going to be conducted by the boards of nursing for each state. So responsibility and liability, we talked a little bit about this earlier. Responsibility is being accountable for your actions. Any individual that commits an act must explain that action and then ultimately accept any consequences. Liability is the legal obligation to make good for that loss or the damage to something which he or she is going to be responsible for. Nurses are personally and legally responsible for their nursing actions. So you are, as a nurse, legally responsible for the care you give or the neglect you give to your patients, as well as your professional and personal conduct. And we say that the best protection against these charges is to make sure that you carry out your duties at or above the expected standards from someone with your education level, ability, and experience. So when we take a job with an employer, we know that we're establishing a legal relationship between each other. So between the employer and the employee has the right to accept wages and provide services to the employer. The employer has the right to hire employees and direct and control the performance of work. So the term that we use to describe the legal responsibility of an employer for the acts of an employee is called respondent superior. So this is where both the nurse and the employer can be held responsible for the nurse's acts. Your employer does establish guidelines. Usually it's referred to as the policies and procedures in each state that decides what action is going to be expected in specific situations. So our institutional and our employer guidelines, those policies and procedures must reflect current conditions in order for them to be effective. So we know that nursing is evidence-based. We know that they're changing constantly as we learn things. So these are going to be changed and updated on a periodic basis. So it's your responsibility to make sure that you stay up to date. And when you're doing certain things in the hospital, when you're performing certain procedures, you need to make sure that you're following those policies and those procedures when you perform those, those tasks. If you make sure that you follow those policies and procedures and you stay abreast of the evidence-based practice, then it puts you in a good position to keep from being liable for any negligence. So standards of care are going to be those guidelines that are developed to identify appropriate levels of professional care. Nursing standards of care help define the average degree of skill, care, and diligence that nurses should provide under the same or similar circumstances. There are certain rules and regulations that define that care that's expected of professional and practical vocational nurses. We know that accrediting agencies and organizations work to develop those standards of care. So we have professional organizations such as American Nurses Association, National Association of Practical Nursing, Education and Services. We also have specialty organizations such as the American Association of Critical Nurses, American Association of Operating Room Nurses, Oncology Nursing Society. So these are those specialty organizations. We talked a little bit about the employer policy and procedure manuals that will be listed in your healthcare facility. We know that these manuals provide that detailed information about how nurses should respond, how they should provide care for patients in certain situations. Nurses who practice according to these institutional policies are going to be legally protected if that standard of care that they provide results in any type of injury to their patient. Failure, obviously, to provide the standard of care expected of that nurse, remember the nurse in that same or similar situation, can result in malpractice suit or disciplinary actions. So we did state a couple slides back that we deal with private law that deals with contracts and torts. So a contract is an agreement between two or more parties. They can be written or they can be verbal promises in which something of value is going to be exchanged. So a nurse who accepts employment offered by an institution, a healthcare provider, or a patient is going to be entering into a contract. When we enter into an employment contract, we should always make sure that we have a written agreement. That written agreement should define the hours that we work, the wages that we will receive for the hours that we work, how long the contract is going to be, any benefits that come along with the position, paid time off, any vacation period, any sick leave that we have, how many hours are we expected to work each week? Is there any insurance coverage? And then we also want to know the job responsibilities that are expected by the employer. The employer, in turn, expects that you provide the services for which you receive these benefits. So these services are often understood to be those that are expected of anyone with the same education and the license that you have. Failure to fulfill any or all parts of that contract is considered a breach of contract. Damages can be awarded to the plaintiff. It can be shown that he or she has suffered a financial loss. So if you decide that you are going to take care of a patient, you're going to provide home care for that patient 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, but then you don't see the patient and you don't abide by that contract, and the patient has to pay another person to render those services, then they can sue you for reimbursement. So torts are an injury or a wrong committed by one person, one group, a group, or an organization against another person, another group, or an organization. The three types of torts are strict liability, intentional, and negligence. So strict liability describes the individual or a group of individuals whose actions, regardless of what their intent was, or negligence, and causes fault or injury to others. So this would be, an example of this would be manufacturers who sell dangerous or defective products that cause injuries to patients. Then we have intentional torts, which are injuries that are caused by willful, forceful, or aggressive behavior. It includes false imprisonment, violation of confidentiality, defamation of character, failure to provide informed consent, assault and battery, and fraud. Intentional torts, so false imprisonment. So this is an example of a false imprisonment is any type of physical or a verbal restraint without the consent of the patient or the appropriate authority. This is when a person is confined or restrained against his or her will, so using restraints on a competent patient to prevent them from leaving the healthcare facility. And restraint is defined as the prevention of movement by any means at all. We have violation of confidentiality. So we know that we're ethically obligated to treat the information that we receive about our patients as confidential. We have a very intimate relationship with our patients. We have access to very personal information about them that we wouldn't normally have access to. So we always have to make sure that we're being upholding that confidentiality. When we talk about defamation of character, so this is making false or malicious is considered intentionally harmful statements to someone that may harm another person's character or reputation. That's going to be defamation or defamation of character. So there's slander, which is statements that are made orally, and libel, which are statements that are going to be written. And then other legal issues, violating that informed consent. So we know that one of a patient's most fundamental rights is the right for them to be able to make their own decisions regarding their own health care. So this means that after they've presented with all the information regarding the care, that they have the right to accept or reject the health care. If a patient decides they're going to accept the health care that was explained to them, then that is to give consent. In order for that consent to be legal, it has to be voluntary, so they have to give it freely, and it has to be informed, which means that the patient clearly understands the alternatives. And we have to make sure that if they do give that consent, that they sign a consent form. Assault and battery is another legal issue for nurses. So one of the most, we do have those intimate relationships with our patients. So one of the common acts that we deliver in nursing care is just a simple touch of a patient, but even touching a patient does require the patient's consent. So this means whether the touching for the patient is in their best interest or not. Whether direct or implied consent is given, the potential for battery does exist. So touching another person without permission can be considered battery. So assault is the conduct of one person, the conduct of one person that makes another person fearful and apprehensive. So this is threatening to do something to a patient, but not actually doing it. So threatening to place a nasogastric tube to a patient who's refusing to eat. We can't do that. Battery is the intentional and wrongful physical contact with a person that involves an injury or offensive contact. So an example would be restraining a client and administering an injection against his will. And then fraud is the intentional deception to prevent a person from receiving what is lawfully theirs. So the example there would be a nurse telling the patient that the medication has no side effects. We know that that's not true. So unintentional torts, we have negligence, malpractice, and gross negligence. Negligence includes the failure of a reasonable person to do something or not to do something that a reasonable person in that same circumstance would or would not do. The negligent person does not intend or plan to commit a wrongful act, but the unreasonable carelessness will cause harm or injury to that person. So describing neglect by a physician or a nurse to apply the education and skills in caring for a patient, which other physicians or nurses customarily apply in a caring situation in caring for similar patients with similar circumstances. For a patient to be ordered to claim negligence, there has to be some harm that resulted from the nurse's action. If there was no harm, then there is no negligence. If some type of harm occurs because the act that was performed was so atrocious that the human life has been severely endangered, or maybe that life has been lost, that's when we call it gross negligence. And then charges against that person can certainly be filed in criminal courts, and criminal charges can be brought against that defendant. Malpractice is the failure of a person with professional training to act in a reasonable and prudent manner. This describes a person who has the average judgment, foresight, intelligence, and skill that would be expected of a person with a similar training and background. There's professional negligence issues that prompt most malpractice suits. When we see these, it's usually failure to use equipment in a responsible and knowledgeable manner, failure to communicate effectively and thoroughly with the patients, and failure to document care that was provided. So how can the nurse minimize risks to prevent malpractice? I do recommend that you guys go to box 11-1 and read over those guidelines for avoiding malpractice claims. It's very important. So we can practice that nursing process. We want to make sure that we're following the standards of care that have been developed. We want to make sure that we avoid medication and treatment errors. So knowing our policies and our procedures, making sure that our med calculations are correct, make sure that we scan our patients, make sure that we scan all of our medications. We want to make sure that we report abnormal findings and issues to the doctors, make sure that after we make that report to them, that we always document that communication. Complete incident reports if there's been any type of incident that occurred with the patient. We want to make sure that we follow our policies for that hospital and report those incidents. We want to make sure that we maintain patient safety. So if they're a high fall risk because they've had multiple falls, or maybe we're giving them medications that put them at risk for falling, we want to make sure that we're keeping them safe. So putting on those bed alarms, putting on that red fall risk bracelet, making sure that they have the non-skid socks on. Educate them about medication side effects, low blood pressure, how they would feel if they had low blood pressure, that they might feel dizzy, they might feel shaky, they should sit on the end of the bed, dangle their feet for a couple minutes, use that call bell, make sure they have their call bell in reach. And then we always want to make sure that we maintain confidentiality and privacy. We also want to make sure that we are assigning and delegating and supervising according to the guidelines. So you guys need to know what you can, the nurse is responsible for providing all the care for the patients, but we know that some of the care that they need can be delegated, but we have to make sure that we only delegate things that can be delegated. So our patients can have a tech or an NST or a CNA, walk them to the bathroom. They can give them something to drink. They're not responsible for interpreting any orders, giving medications, things like that. Make sure you're accepting an assignment for which you are qualified for, knowing your scope of practice, knowing what you can and you can't do. Always participate in continuing education. We know that nursing is evidence-based practice, and evidence-based practice is always changing. So our need for continuing education is extremely important so that we always know the best practices for our patients. We want to make sure that we observe professional boundaries. So keeping our professional relationship and not crossing the line. We want to make sure we absorb mandatory reporting regulations, and then we obtain informed consent. So that mandatory reporting regulations, that's if there's child abuse or elder abuse, sexual abuse, things like that. Informed consent, we know, is a person's agreement to allow something to happen. So it can be some type of a diagnostic procedure, it can be some type of a surgery, but that informed consent is going to be based on a full disclosure of all the benefits and all the risks. So they need to have a clear understanding of both. After they get that clear understanding, then they can accept or decline. Except in the case of an emergency, failure to obtain consent on patients can result in legal actions being taken against that healthcare provider. If a patient is going to be unable to give consent, then somebody that has been legally authorized for them will need to sign on their behalf. All right. Legal issues for nursing. So malpractice continuing. Please make sure you go to 241 box 11.3. So just some more tips for avoiding, being liable for negligence. So following those standards of care, giving that competent care, communicating with other team members. We know how important this is. Everybody on that healthcare team works together for the greater good of the patient. So make sure you're communicating with speech. Make sure you're talking with physical therapy and occupational therapy. Make sure you're developing that caring rapport with your patients, and make sure you're documenting thoroughly all of your assessments, any interventions and evaluations. So remember, we said earlier, if you have a patient who has low blood pressure and you need to contact the doctor, you're always going to make sure that you make a note in the computer that you contacted so-and-so about the patient's low blood pressure. But you really can't just stop there. We have to say, how did we address it? What did we do? So we contacted the doctor. Were there any new orders that were received? If there were, what were those orders? If there were no new orders, make sure that you put in there no new orders. If they ordered medication, you want to put in there that you gave the medication, and then you want to document that you evaluated. So you should have vitals in there that show a set of vitals before you talk to the doctor, a set of vitals before you give that medication, and then a set of vitals after you're giving that medication. So make sure you're really thoroughly documenting that assessment, any interventions and evaluations. So we know that patients' perceptions do contribute to malpractice issues that we see. So just some people think highly of the American healthcare system, others do not. So some people are always looking for issues. Some people believe that healthcare is a very big and profitable business. Some people believe that the liability insurance justifies making claims. Well, we can make a claim. It doesn't matter. It's not coming out of their pocket. That's what they pay insurance for. We do see that patients, hear stories, or they see stories on social media and in the news where people get these enormous $1 million settlements. So this can be encouraging for some people. So all these issues together contribute to the issues that we see with malpractice. We do see certain traits for patients that we consider suit-prone patients. So these are patients that are very quick to sue for damages, whether these damages are real or it's even justified. So these patients usually exhibit very high levels of criticism. They're pretty negative. They find fault in almost all the care that they're receiving. They can be very hostile and uncooperative, very sensitive to being offended. And then they've usually had successful prior lawsuits in which they've been awarded damages or payment. So some prevention for discouraging lawsuits. Again, make sure you have strict personal and institutional adherence to those high standards of care. Attention to that accurate documentation and being aware of different areas where nurses are going to be found to be negligent. So when we talk about documentation, we know that the patient's medical record is a legal document. You can, if there's ever been any type of issue with the patient and there's any type of lawsuit with the patient or malpractice, they're going to come back to this patient's medical record and they're going to examine it inside and out. Anyone that was in it, anyone that looked at it, anybody that documented it, any care that was provided, we're going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. So you want to make sure that you're documenting appropriately in the patient's medical file. We want to be careful that anything that we do document, that it has to be factual, it has to be to the point, it should be accurate, it should be legible if it's a handwritten chart, and it should always be related to the patient's needs or the plan of treatment. It must be objective and it has to be consistent. So we want to leave out any personal opinion, we just want to stick to the facts. We want to make sure that we're using agency-approved abbreviations, only abbreviations that are considered legal, and chart correction procedures. So if you make a mistake in a chart, you want to follow your organization's policies regarding making corrections. And then we want to make sure that we keep our computer charting confidential. So we should always keep our screen minimized, and we shouldn't be in anybody's chart if we don't belong in their chart, if we're not actually caring for that patient. So we talked somewhat about delegation. So you as the licensed nurse are going to be accountable for determining the appropriateness of those tasks that you delegate. So in 2006, the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, along with the American Nurses Association, worked together to create a document that provides guidelines on the licensed nurse's role in delegating those nurses' tasks. So the best way for a nurse to avoid being sued for any type of negligence is to constantly look for and correct situations in which a patient may suffer an injury. So we want to make sure that when our patients are, if a tech comes to you and said, oh, I did vitals on Mrs. So-and-so, her blood pressure is orthostatic. These are not things that they're trained to do. These are not decisions that they should be making. So you couldn't just take the thought of the tech and just run with that. You would have to look at the vital signs yourself and make that decision yourself. That wouldn't really be something that the nursing tech could do. They could grab the vitals, but they're not really responsible for interpreting them because they don't have that knowledge or the background. So it is recommended that you guys have malpractice insurance. So malpractice insurance, usually employers do carry malpractice liability insurance, not only to protect themselves, but their employees as well. It is an important and a very wise investment to have personal malpractice insurance because settlements sometimes in malpractice can exceed what the employer policy limits are set for, and they can then come after you. And then employers' insurance companies can actually sue you if they believe that loss that they incurred was caused because of your negligent actions. There are some policies that are claim-based rather than occurrence-based. So a claim-based policy is going to cover a claim made while that policy is in effect. If your employer then discontinues the policy and a claim is made later, which is what usually happens, then you would not be covered. That occurrence-based policy provides coverage if the incident occurs within the policy period. If the policy is allowed to lapse and then a suit is filed for an incident that occurred during the policy, then coverage would be in place. So some other legal issues for nurses, we're going to talk about wills and gifts. So wills are considered legal statement of a person's wishes regarding disposition of their property after they pass away. Usually attorneys are the most appropriate to help writing the will because they know all the specifics. You want to follow institutional guidelines regarding witnessing a will. If witnessing a signature is permitted, more than one witness will be required. So always refer back to your policy, your institutional guidelines if you're not sure to see about that. And then when we talk about gifts, so we know that some of our patients are just extremely appreciative of the care we provide and they want to give gifts. Sometimes they bring food, sometimes they bring drinks, flowers, things like that. We don't ever want to accept any gifts or money. We always want to make sure that we're being very courteous when we tell them that we can't accept the gift. But not accepting the gift is usually just the appropriate response. It's legal to accept the gift. It's not illegal, but it's just not ethical. So it's just kind of something that we want to stay away from. So a crime we know is an offense that's going to be committed against the public welfare or safety. We know that the state is responsible for prosecuting those criminal acts. We talked about some of the minor offenses. We talked about misdemeanors. We talked about felonies. Practicing nursing in a state without a license is considered a felony, which comes with jail time. Grossly negligent acts that cause harm to patients are considered crimes. Criminal background, elder abuse, and child abuse checks are going to be done usually prior to hiring because we don't want any issues with patients because it increases the risk of, one of these acts occurring. And then we should also see that employers have drug and alcohol screening prior to being hired as well. And lastly, other crimes that nurses may be directly or indirectly involved in. We see these right to die situations, violations of federal and state narcotic and controlled substance abuse laws, either with, you could find yourself abusing them, or taking them and selling them, or maybe you yourself could just find yourself being involved with another employee who did something like this that you happen to, observe, and you could be involved that way. Fraud, which is falsifying patients' bills, so charging patients for things that we didn't do. Robbery, so, stealing a patient's belongings. Death due to incorrect or a lack of appropriate nursing care. And then murder. And that is the conclusion of trends and legal and ethical issues.